I was 63 years old, standing in my kitchen in my bathrobe, holding a piece of paper that made my hands shake so badly I had to grip the counter to keep from falling. The number on that paper was $22,400,000. I set it down. I picked it up again. I read it again. Same number. My husband was in the garage, sanding down an old rocking chair he'd been working on for 2 weeks. I could hear the slow, steady scrape of sandpaper through the window. The same man who'd asked me to spot him $40 last Tuesday because he said he was short until his next odd job came in. $22 million. Let me back up, because I know how this sounds, and I know what you're already thinking. But there are things you need to understand first. Things about who I was before he came into my life, and what my life actually looked like when he walked into it. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse at Mercy General in Columbus, Ohio. I raised my daughter Rebecca, mostly on my own after her father and I divorced when she was 9. I bought my house on Clover Street with money I saved over 12 years, penny by careful penny. I drove a 10-year-old Buick. I clipped coupons on Sunday mornings. I was not a woman who needed to be rescued, and I was not a woman who made foolish decisions. I had earned every single thing I had, and I was proud of that. When I retired at 61, I thought I was done with surprises. I thought the rest of my life would be quiet and predictable and mine. I was not unhappy about that. I had my garden. I had my book club on Thursday nights. I had Rebecca and my 2 grandchildren 20 minutes away. I had enough. Then my back porch started rotting. It was my neighbor, Donna, who recommended him. She said her cousin had used him for a deck rebuild and the work was excellent and he was reasonable on price. She handed me a folded piece of paper with a phone number on it and said his name was Walter. He showed up on a Tuesday morning in a truck that looked like it had survived a war. He was maybe 65, stocky, with thick gray hair and hands that told you everything about how he'd spent his life. Calloused, stained with old paint and wood finish. The hands of a man who worked with them every single day. He looked at my porch, crouched down, pressed on a few boards, stood back up, and gave me a number. It was lower than the 2 other quotes I'd gotten. I said fine. He started the next Monday. He was quiet while he worked. Not unfriendly, just focused. He brought his own coffee in a thermos. He didn't ask to use my bathroom until the 3rd day, and even then he apologized for asking. He cleaned up every evening before he left. Every single evening. Swept up the sawdust, stacked the scrap wood neatly by the fence. I started bringing him a second cup of coffee around 10, just to be neighborly. By the end of the first week, I knew he was from Denton, Texas originally, that he'd been doing carpentry and general repair work for going on 40 years, that he had a son in Portland he didn't speak to much, and that his wife had passed 6 years earlier from ovarian cancer. He said that last part the way people do when they've said it many times and learned to keep their voice steady doing it, but his eyes went somewhere else for a moment. The porch took 3 weeks. By the time it was done, I'd started looking forward to 10 o'clock in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a while. I told Rebecca about him one Sunday at dinner. I said there was a man fixing my porch, and he was very nice and easy to talk to. She looked at me the way only your adult children can look at you, like you've said something both obvious and slightly embarrassing. She said, "Mom, just invite him to dinner." I did not invite him to dinner. I did, however, ask him if he might have time to look at the kitchen cabinet that had been sticking for 2 years. He said he could take a look. Then I mentioned the bathroom faucet, then the fence gate. He kept coming back, and I kept finding things, and eventually we both knew what was happening even though neither of us said it directly for another 2 months. He asked me to dinner first, a Thursday night, very straightforward, very plain about it. He said there was a barbecue place on Route 9 he liked and he thought I might enjoy it. I said that sounded fine. It was better than fine. We sat there for 3 hours and I laughed more than I had in years. He was funny in a way that crept up on you, dry, quiet, perfectly timed. He had opinions about things, strong ones. He was not a man who agreed with everything you said just to be agreeable, and I respected that enormously. That was in October. By the following spring, he was spending 3 or 4 nights a week at my house. I want to be clear about something. I was not naive. I was 62 years old. I had been around long enough to recognize when something felt right and when something felt wrong, And Walter felt right. He felt honest. He felt like a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. But I was aware of the money situation. Of course I was. He worked when work came in, which was not always consistent. Some months were better than others. He lived in a rented room on the east side of town, which he'd mentioned almost apologetically the first time we talked about where we each lived. He drove that battered truck. He never seemed to have cash on him without having to think about it first. When we went out to eat, I usually paid. He would sometimes protest and then let me, and I told myself that was just practicality, not laziness, not taking advantage. My friend Carol was the first one to say something. We were walking the park trail one morning, and I was telling her about a weekend trip Walter and I had taken to Hocking Hills, and she stopped walking and said, "Evelyn, who paid for that?" I said I did, that I'd gotten a deal on the cabin. She said, "And the one before that?" I didn't answer right away. She wasn't unkind about it. Carol has been my friend for 22 years, and she is not a cruel person. But she said, "I just want you to be careful. You've worked so hard your whole life." I drove home feeling prickly and defensive, and then I sat with it for a few days, and I understood that her concern came from love. So I watched more carefully after that. I noticed things I'd been letting slide past, the way he'd grow quiet and vague when money came up, the way he'd accept help with what felt like just a touch too much ease, the way certain months the odd jobs seemed to dry up entirely and he didn't seem worried. Rebecca was more direct than Carol. She said, "Mom, how old is he? Has he saved anything for retirement? Does he have any kind of plan?" Her voice had that particular edge daughters get when they're frightened for you and expressing it as irritation. I told her Walter was a private person and I wasn't going to interrogate him about his finances like he was applying for a loan. She said, "I just don't want you supporting someone the rest of your life on your nursing pension." I said I appreciated her concern. What I didn't say was that I'd already started thinking about it too. That some nights, lying there listening to him breathe, I'd run quiet little calculations in my head. What things cost, what I had, what the future might ask of me. I am a practical woman. I could not stop being practical just because I loved someone, and I did love him. That had happened without any fanfare or announcement. It was just suddenly true, the way some true things are. We'd been together almost 2 years when he first mentioned getting married. We were sitting on the back porch, my beautiful new porch, watching the fireflies come out, and he said it in the same casual tone he might say we were low on coffee. He said, "I've been thinking we ought to get married." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Walter, we've never once talked about money." "Not really." He said, "I know." I said, "I need to know we're on the same page. I have my house. I have my pension. I have some savings I've built carefully over a long time. I'm not interested in combining finances with someone if we don't have an honest conversation first." He nodded slowly. He looked out at the yard. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "That's fair. Can I have a little time?" I said, "Of course." I thought he meant a few days, maybe a week. He meant it differently than I understood. 3 weeks went by, then a month. He didn't bring it up again, and when I gently circled back toward it, he grew uncomfortable in a way that was hard to read. Not evasive, exactly. More like a man sitting with something heavy, trying to figure out how to put it down. Then one afternoon in September, I was looking for the receipt for a ceiling fan I needed to return. I knew Walter had been helping me organize the kitchen drawer, and I thought maybe he'd set it somewhere. I went to the small desk in the hallway where we both sometimes left papers, and I found an envelope from a wealth management company in Cincinnati. Not sealed. I didn't dig into it. I didn't open it deliberately. I just picked it up to see if my receipt might be under it, and the flap was already open, and one page was already half pulled out. The words at the top were, "Account Summary." I should have put it down. I know that. I didn't put it down. I read the account holder's name, Walter James Briggs. I read the account value, 2241美元. The paper shook in my hands. The refrigerator hummed. I could hear the sandpaper in the garage, that slow, patient sound. $22 million. I put the paper back exactly as I'd found it. I walked to the living room. I sat on the couch. I stared at the blank television screen, and I did something I hadn't done since my divorce. I completely fell apart. Not loudly, I just sat there and cried in a way that was less about sadness and more about something deeper, something I didn't have a word for yet. Because here's the thing no one tells you about a moment like this. It's not clean. It's not just one emotion. I wasn't simply angry. I wasn't simply hurt. It was everything at once. A tangle of things I couldn't separate. The trips I'd paid for, the dinners, the groceries I'd bought without thinking twice, the conversations I'd had with Rebecca in my head, defending him, saying he was a good man, he was just going through a lean time. This is not what you think it is. The way I had quietly worried, quietly calculated, the way he had let me. He came inside about 20 minutes later. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, dried them on the dish towel, and came to the doorway of the living room. He looked at my face. He went very still. He said, "Evelyn." I said, "There's an envelope on the desk." He closed his eyes. He stood there a moment without moving, and then he walked to the couch and sat down beside me, not too close. He left space between us like he understood he might not be welcome right next to me. I said, "I wasn't snooping. I want you to know that." He said, "I know." I said, $22 million, Walter." He didn't say anything. I said, "I have spotted you grocery money. I have paid for our vacations. I lay awake at night wondering if I was being foolish with my retirement. And you have $22 million. He said quietly. Yes. The room was very still. I asked him how. He told me. His wife, his first wife, the one who'd passed, had come from a family with deep roots in Texas oil. She'd inherited substantially, invested carefully, grown it over decades. When she died, everything came to him. He said it had happened at a time in his grief when the money felt obscene, wrong. He hadn't earned it. He hadn't wanted it. He'd kept working because working was the only thing that had made sense to him since she died. I said, "That doesn't explain why you hid it from me." He took a long breath. He looked at his hands in his lap. He said, "The last woman I was serious about this was about a year before I met you. Things changed the moment she found out. The way she looked at me changed. What she wanted changed. What she talked about changed. It was like meeting a completely different person." He paused. "I didn't want that to happen with you," I said. "So you tested me." He said, "I know how that sounds." I said, "It sounds like you decided for me. You decided I couldn't be trusted, without asking me, without knowing me." He didn't argue with that. He sat with it. I watched him sit with it. He said, "You're right. That's exactly what I did." I got up and went to the kitchen. I made myself a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, looking out the window at the yard, at the porch he'd built me, at the fence gate he'd rehung, at all the small ways he'd been present in my life for 2 years. I thought about Rebecca's face when she asked me who was paying for things. I thought about Carol on the park trail. I thought about the nights I'd lain there running numbers in my head, quietly afraid. I said, without turning around, "I am 63 years old. I raised my daughter alone. I worked 31 years on my feet. I have never in my life needed someone to take care of me financially, and I was not looking for that when I found you. I was not with you for money." He said, "I know that now." I said, "You should have known it then." He said, "Yes, I should have." I told him I needed time. He said he understood. He picked up his thermos from the counter and his jacket from the hook by the door, and he left. He didn't push. He didn't argue. He just went. Rebecca came over that evening because she could tell from my voice on the phone that something had happened. I told her everything. I watched her face cycle through about 7 different expressions in 30 seconds. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment, and then she said, carefully, "Mom, how do you feel about him? Not the money, him." I said, "The same." She said, "That's important." I said, "It doesn't make what he did okay." She said, "No, it doesn't. But it's still important." I didn't call him for 9 days. 9 days is a long time when you're used to hearing someone's voice every day. I filled the time with the garden, with my book club, with long walks where I tried to untangle what I was actually feeling from what I thought I should be feeling. There was real hurt there. Real hurt. The feeling of having been quietly assessed, watched, put through some kind of test I hadn't consented to take. The indignity of it. I was not a young woman who didn't know her own mind. I had not given him any reason to doubt me. But I also kept coming back to the version of events from his side. A man drowning in grief. A man who had watched someone's eyes change when they learned what he was worth. A man who had found something real, and was so terrified of losing it that he'd made a terrible, quiet mistake trying to protect it. On the 9th day I called him. I said I wanted to meet. We met at the barbecue place on Route 9, because that was where it had started. I had written things down so I wouldn't lose my nerve or my clarity. I told him everything I'd been sitting with. The hurt, the dignity I felt had been taken from me without my permission. The loneliness of worrying about something he had the power to make irrelevant and chose not to. I told him all of it, and I didn't soften any of it. And he listened to every word without interrupting, without defending himself. When I finished, he said, "You're right about all of it. Every word. I handled this with fear instead of respect, and that was wrong." I said, "If we do this, and I'm not saying we are, there will be no more tests. No more decisions made for me about what I can handle knowing. I am a grown woman, Walter. Treat me like one." He said, "I will. I promise you." I said, "And I'll need you to understand something. I don't want your money. I have never wanted your money. What I want is for you to be honest with me. That is not a complicated requirement." He said, "I know. And it's the one I failed at." We sat there a while. The food came and we ate it, and it was quiet between us in the way it gets quiet between people who have said the hard things and are letting them settle. He said, "Before we left, I know I don't have the right to ask you to stay, but I am asking, because what we have is the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time, and I was an idiot and I know it." I said I needed a little more time. He nodded. He paid the check. I let him. On the drive home, I thought about something my mother used to say. She'd say that the measure of a person isn't in whether they make mistakes, because everyone makes mistakes. It's in what they do when the mistake is sitting right there in front of them, undeniable. She said some people argue with it. Some people minimize it. Some people just say, "Yes, that was me, and I'm sorry." Walter had said yes. He hadn't argued. He hadn't told me I was overreacting. He hadn't brought up the other woman to justify himself, not as an excuse anyway. He just said, "You're right, and I'm sorry." That counted for something. It counted for a lot. I told Rebecca my decision the following Sunday. She listened. She didn't say I was wrong. She said, "Just make sure you're doing it because you want to, not because it's easier." I said, "I know the difference." She looked at me for a long moment with those eyes that are the same shape as her father's, but have always seen things the way I see them. She said, "Yeah, you do." I called Walter on a Monday morning. He picked up on the second ring. I could hear the workshop sounds in the background, that same sandpaper sound, that same steady patience. I said, "I have conditions." He said, "Tell me." I said, "Full honesty from here forward, not just about money, about everything. If something is bothering you, you say it. If you're afraid of something, you say it. We don't protect each other by keeping things from each other. We protect each other by telling the truth." He said, "Agreed." I said, "And, going forward, you pay for dinner." There was a pause. And then he laughed that low, quiet laugh I had missed for 9 days more than I'd expected to miss anything at 63 years old. He said, "Deal." We got married the following April, on a Saturday morning at the county courthouse with Rebecca and her husband and my 2 grandchildren and Carol standing in as witnesses. I wore a blue dress I'd bought on sale in February. Walter wore a jacket I'd never seen before, dark gray, and he looked good in it. He'd had his hair cut. Rebecca cried. I did not. I was too busy being completely quietly certain. Afterward, we went to the barbecue place on Route 9, all 6 of us crowded into a corner booth. My grandson, who was 7, asked Walter if he was a grandpa now. Walter thought about it and said he supposed he was. My grandson considered this very seriously and then asked if Walter was good at fishing. Walter said he was decent at it. My grandson said that was acceptable. That night, after everyone had gone home, Walter and I sat on the back porch in the dark, the same way we had the night he'd first mentioned marriage. The fireflies were just starting to come out, a few early ones blinking slowly in the yard. He said, I know I don't deserve how this turned out. I said, You probably don't, But here we are. He reached over and took my hand, and I let him hold it. The night was warm and the yard smelled like cut grass and the new wood of the flower boxes he'd built for me in March. My porch was solid under my feet. Everything around me had been shaped by the hands of a man who thought caring for things quietly, without show, was how you demonstrated love. He hadn't been wrong about that part. He'd just forgotten that love also requires honesty to hold its shape. We sat there for a long time without saying anything. You reach a certain age and you understand the value of that. Of just sitting beside someone in the dark, not needing to fill the silence. Both of you present, both of you exactly where you mean to be. I am 64 now. I still clip coupons on Sunday mornings, because old habits live in your hands. I still drive the Buick. Some things don't need to change just because the circumstances do. Walter still works. He takes jobs he wants, turns down the ones he doesn't, and donates more money than I'll probably ever know to a hospice organization in his first wife's name. He told me that part eventually, on his own, without me asking. Small piece of a larger truth he'd been holding. There will always be things two people don't say right away. That is just the nature of learning someone. What matters is that the door stays open, that when something is ready to be said, it finds its way out. Rebecca calls every Sunday. My grandson can now confirm that Walter is, in fact, good enough at fishing. The porch is still holding up perfectly. I think it always will.